Hey everyone, it's Louisa Tannermunson from Feel Good Astrology. I forgot where I was there. So I wanted to share with you a few thoughts about Saturn return and what you can do to prepare for your Saturn return. As far as I can see it, there's loads of different ways of thinking about it, but one of the easy ways is to think in terms of these four areas of your life and really pay them some focus. So I'm going to give you some ideas and a little bit of help in terms of how you might choose to look at your Saturn return and also the kinds of attitudes that are going to help you with it. Before I go too much into the Saturn return itself, I want to just talk a little bit in terms of Saturn. What does Saturn represent in our lives and in our charts? Well, Saturn is there to really show us all the things that we get from our parents, I think. I mean, Saturn's all about rules and regulations and structure and obligations and discipline. And if you think about it, like, where do we learn about that usually? We usually learn it from our parents and our families, and then later on from our schools, and possibly from any interactions that we have with police and nurses and doctors and teachers, and then later on as we get older, it's governments and our bosses and things like that. So Saturn shows up as areas of responsibility, but also areas of authority in our lives. So authority figures, parents, bosses, anyone we look up to seems to be a bit of a Saturn type. Saturn also has a bit more of a predisposition towards men rather than women. And if you think, what does Saturn represent? Well, Saturn's the ruler of Capricorn. He's also the ruler of Aquarius, but he's mostly known for his energy in the sign of Capricorn. Saturn is very much associated with status. If you think in terms of Capricorn, and if you think in terms of which house does Saturn naturally rule, that'd be the 10th and the 11th. But the 10th is the one that really comes up for me as a place of Saturn energy. And that's the place of, our status and our drive to achieve things. Now, all of these areas really come into play as we are approaching our Saturn return, because it is a time to reflect on how far we've managed to go. Now, I'm going to be talking more about the Saturn return with a couple of astrology buddies on Wednesday. I'm doing a live stream in a couple of days' time where we're actually going to talk about our experiences of going through our first Saturn return, and one of my buddies is actually going to share about her second Saturn return as well. I've worked with loads of people helping them through the Saturn returns and seeing them safely the other side. I'm also going to be recording a video about if you're about to go through your Saturn return, whether it's your first or your second, through the sign of Pisces. So watch out for that. It's going to be released this week. So, this isn't just specifically about Saturn in Pisces at the return. This is in general, like if you know that your Saturn return is coming up, say you've got Saturn in Aries or Taurus, these are actually the times, even though it seems like a long way off, there are some kind of traps that we get into, and we get further and further into these traps quite easily before the Saturn return. So this is just kind of like an informal heads up with some key points to look at. Other things that Saturn is very much a ruler of, and that's our structures in our life. If we think about any kind of foundations in our homes, if we think about our bodies, we've got our bones, our teeth, our muscular connections, our connections and ligaments between our muscles and things like that. So Saturn also has something about a posture. And if you also think about Saturn as a planet and the way it looks, it's got boundaries, it's got its rings around it, allegedly, which gives us the idea that there are places for all of us to be in, little boxes or little cages or however you want to see it. So things like that are key at the time of the Saturn return. So here's where I think you can really make a difference if you are approaching your Saturn return, if you're in your Saturn return, if you know you've got another one coming, or actually if you're going through any kind of Saturn event. Like right now I've got Saturn cruising by my I see the angle right at the bottom of my chart and heading towards my moon. So let's face it, I've got a bit of a Saturn event going on myself. But what I would break it down into, these are 4 sections, and these are the 4 sections or pillars of your life or key focal points. And they're pretty broad. So I haven't like specified them down too much. But the first one is our relationships, because it shows our connection between us and everything else. And of course, if we're thinking about our connections and everyone else, that also incorporates things like obligations and boundaries and things like that. It represents the pressures that we might be carrying for people, the responsibilities we might be taking on for people, and also the judgments, because Saturn is a planet that's absolutely known for its judgments. So, relationships are the first thing, I would recommend that you start looking at ahead of time. And I'll dig down into this a little bit more. The next thing I would think in terms of is your professionalism and your achievements and your security that's based around those. So, like, where are you heading in terms of your direction, and what do you need to do as part of your job, and in return for what? All the nuts and bolts of your job. And I'll give you some good questions to consider as you're coming up to your Saturn return. Then I would really think about your relationship to yourself. So we've looked at the outer relationships, between you and other people, like you and everyone else. It's a bit like the first and the seventh house, but I mean, they are very structural houses. So, like the next one I would really consider is the relationship that you have to yourself. And that, I guess, that's really focused on your body, like a bit like your first house, really. So I would be considering, how are you talking to yourself? How are you treating yourself? How are you looking after your physical health and your mental health, which is all kind of part of your body, really. It's the package that is you. So looking at yourself is really important. And then I would also look at your sort of base security. So we've looked at your outer security, which I guess you could say is just like your 10th house. It's actually quite funny. As I'm saying this, I'm realizing that my model is actually matching the angles. Like the last one I would say is your base, the security, your home, and how you're living, the intimacy that you've got in your life. Now, with all these things, I recommend you do a deep dive on, and I'll give you some questions to consider in terms of each of these focal points, because these questions will let you know how far away you are from feeling at ease and how close you are to things going kind of wrong or things getting too pressured. The thing with the Saturn return is it always brings us extra pressure. It tightens things around us. If you think of the rings of Saturn, at the time of the Saturn return, it almost feels like you're being hugged by a boa constrictor. It feels like everything gets tight around you with a Saturn event, in particular, the Saturn returns. Everything feels really tight. So what you want to be doing is creating a sense of freedom and a sense of space in your life, in all the big areas of your life. So these 4 things, like your relationship to yourself and your body and how you're looking after yourself, your relationships to everybody else, your career and how you're moving outwardly, and then also your stability in your core and how you're moving inwardly. Now, the other thing I would say, yes, you're wanting to create a sense of space and ease so that you don't feel like everything is imploding on you. But I would say the Saturn return really differs in terms of a Pluto event or a Uranus event. Like with a Uranus event, like if, obviously I haven't been through my Uranus return, you get there when you're 84. But I've gone through my Uranus half return, i.e. my Uranus opposition. And during that time, like with a Uranus event, when Uranus is going over one of your key planets or angles, you are wanting to break free, like you're really wanting to run and break free of something. You're wanting to be inventive. You're wanting to create change, and you're almost wanting to obliterate the traces and the tracks of it. Now, Saturn energy is not like that. So you don't want to be doing that. And we run the risk of doing that if we're not really prepared when there's a Saturn return coming, because, when things feel tight, often, we take action without necessarily considering it. But Saturn isn't like that. Saturn doesn't operate in a rushed way. Saturn is kind of slow and methodical and very disciplined. And, some might say boring. I mean, I have to say, Saturn doesn't necessarily light me up. It really doesn't. The thought of like Saturn type things going on doesn't thrill me necessarily, but I see it's the nuts and bolts. And, we do need to get our nuts and bolts right. Um, Similarly with Pluto, when you've got Pluto in a difficult place going around your chart, aspecting an angle or going over your moon or your sun, it can be incredibly painful. But really what what Pluto is wanting us to do is to surrender to something. It's the death of something. It represents the end of part of our journey. So it's a bit like Uranus, because there's an ending maybe and a change, but there's also a rebirth. And we are surrendering. So it's quite an interesting dynamic to surrender. But with Saturn, it's nothing of the sort. It's very much about what you're managing. And Saturn returns in particular are wanting you to manage everything really effectively. And, when you do manage it well, you can progress to the next level. So for instance, with these Saturn returns, we often get these kind of hero journeys that we're going on. There's it's almost like there's a dragon to slay, but we've got to do it in a really calm and measured way, and we need to really use the skills that we've built up. It's not really calling for us to rip off our clothes and become Superman or Spider-Man or whoever it is that turns you on, but it's about how we gracefully move through life and how we are showing our maturity, how we are showing the groundedness and the stability that we've already acquired. And it's also, I think, very much about knowing when to let go of things as well. So it's not, I must let go of this now. It's, I'm choosing to let go of this because this isn't in my interest. It's a very, very different energy. So here's some of the things that I would consider if I was going through a Saturn return right now. Now, in terms, before I say that, I just want to say it's about calibration. That's, it's not about necessarily like making a wild sweeping gesture. Saturn returns and managing Saturn returns effectively, or mastering it, it's about calibration. So, you want to be calibrating, you want to be thinking into each of these 4 areas and thinking, okay, what can I tweak here? What will feel better? And if this isn't enough of a tweak, what else can I do? So it's not a massive change that you're looking to do. It is all about the balance. So I'm going to give you some questions now and things to consider coming up to your Saturn return. So if we the first one I mentioned was relationships, because they're often the most obvious ones that are going on, and giving us a bit of grief leading up to a Saturn return. So Saturn in a birth chart also represents parents, and also represents the parent-child relationship. So dependent on whether this is your first Saturn return or your second Saturn return. If it's your second Saturn return, you probably have had your ass kicked a few times. So you might be a bit more sensible about it, or a bit more maybe cynical. I don't know, maybe discerning. Discerning is a good word. And if it's your first one, you might be dealing more on the parent side. So you might have things to deal with your parents, and you might not yet have children. In fact, you might choose not to have children. If you're coming up to your second return, your second Saturn return, the chances are you've had children. You might even be a grandparent, and you might also be about to lose parents, because you've got your first Saturn return around the age of 29 and a half. Your second one's taking place around about the age of 58. Funnily enough, it's also at a time when Jupiter returns are coming around as well. So some people get their Saturn return and their Jupiter return in the same year. So these are really important times. So in terms of relationships, then, questions that you might be asking. So for instance, if you're not sure about your role in life and things like that, you might be asking, who's responsible for this? Why is this happening? You might be blaming people. If you notice you're blaming a lot of people in your life, and in particular your parents. That's a massive Saturn thing going on. So often we realize that the problems that we've got are because of our associations or what we've learned from people in this, that, and the other. So where we've not been responsible for ourselves, one of the clues that we need to take more personal responsibility is the fact that it feels like everything that we've done, we followed all the rules, we followed the advice of our parents, and things are getting stickier and stickier. It doesn't feel like we've got much grace there. This is quite a problem, around the age of 29 to 30. By that time, a lot of people have moved home and, they've been supporting themselves for quite some time. And yet it's not that long ago that we had the voice of our parents in our head saying, if you work hard, you'll get this and you'll get that and you'll get this and you'll get that and this will happen. And actually, the truth of it is, it's largely a load of bullshit. And by the time we get to that age, we are really sick of it. And so, you've got this choice at the time of the Saturn return. You could really collapse in on yourself and really go judgy and blamey towards your parents, judgy and blamey towards all the other generations, judgy and blamey towards anyone that seems to be restricting you or guiding you or coaching you or helping you. What this is really doing is opening you up to the possibility that you are the person you've been waiting for. And it's about you taking responsibility. So, you might have taken other people's advice, but now it's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. And now is the time to realize that, yes, you're still a young person, you're a young individual, but you're not an old giffer either, but you're definitely not a child. And you are going through this big change. And it is time for you to absolutely recognize that it's on your shoulders. And the chances are you can get help if you need it, but it's a stepping over point. Now, a lot of people, if they've had relationships where they've had lots of responsibilities put on them, what I notice around the time of the Saturn return is where too much has been put on our shoulders, we often feel really tight in our relationships. And so we seek to get rid of them. So lots of serious relationships that haven't quite been communicated very well. I got into a relationship in my age 20. And by the time of my Saturn return, that relationship was kind of dead in the water. And yet I didn't really know how to extricate myself from it. I didn't know how to process it. When I looked at my peers, I didn't really see any great relationships around me. And I didn't really see many people that were giving great relationship advice. And it was a tough time. And it's like, how do you navigate this? How do you take full responsibility for how you've ended up? Or how, I guess the question is, it's easy. Like when you don't know the rules of relating, when it's your first relationship, when you've only had terrible relationships reflected back at you your whole life, how are you going to know how relationships work, without getting, a broken nail or two? Things are going to go wrong, and they often go wrong with our first relationship. So lots of relationships and friendships do tend to break down at this time, but it's not because they're intrinsically bad. It's because you realize what you've built and what you've held on so tightly for, in this like quest for meaning is actually kind of meaningless. It's actually squashing you in. So, it's often a time for you to communicate, this is actually what I need right now. This isn't working for me, and this is what I need to do, and this is the action I'm going to take. So it's very much about moving yourself into a place of greater authenticity and greater freedom. So like if you are coming up to this time and you're already in a relationship that is not faring very well, then it's worth like reading some books on great ways to resolve conflict and ways to navigate yourself out of a relationship. Because how long is a piece of string? If you do this badly or if it goes badly, and let's face it, we're all learning right now. We're always learning, but it will take so much longer. With the Saturn return, things slow right down and they get stodgier and heavier, and you have less, it feels like you have less resources there to help you. So yeah, the parent-child relationships and your loving relationships and friendships that you've been in, could be really under pressure. Another way of seeing this is that you've grown. And actually, you've grown away from the people that were important to you, and they still are. They're part of your journey. They're part of the story of you and how you've got this far. And now it looks like you might need other people by your side, and other people to come into the story. If you imagine this like a performance, there would be an interval. And during that interval, when everyone's getting their ice creams, your new partner or your new best friend or that new transformer that's coming into your life will just be about to step on stage. So, funny thing is with life, it's much easier when you create the space for the new things to come in. So with the Saturn return, the easier and more cleanly that you're able to let go of things, the easier it is for the new possibilities to come in. Saturn will kick your bum for sure. Saturn is like a taskmaster, and he'll see that you get the lesson. He won't give you credit unless you actually learn the lesson. So yeah, that's big. Lots of people, people who have children quite early before the Saturn return often find it overwhelming around the time of the Saturn return. So it's important to seek advice and support from your community, but also to realize that you are in control. And even though you became a parent very young or quite young, you have everything that you need to be able to get this done. But again, it's realizing that you are growing up at the same time as your child, and that you have to be one step ahead, and it's tough. So yeah, this is about growing up in your relationships and recognizing that the responsibility lies with you. Now, during this time, you might find that people are dishing on you. So you might have people throwing judgments at you, telling you how irresponsible you are, how unlovable you are, how you're not matching up, you're not showing up, you're this, that, and the other. When the judgments are coming towards you, it's usually an indication that there's something inside you that you actually believe. If people were judging you and you knew that it was not true, it wouldn't bother you. It would just kind of go over your head. But if people are judging you in such a way that you're catching it, it's because there's something in that you might believe, or it's almost bringing up your self-doubt, which again is about stabilizing your self-image and your confidence, your self-confidence, which comes to my point about getting your relationship with yourself right. So they kind of go hand in hand, a bit like the first and the seventh house. So, in terms of getting your relationship to yourself right, you really want to feel like you know yourself. And if I consider what it was like for me as a teen, as a child, a teen, like by the time I got to my 20s, I really wanted to define myself. I really wanted to show my parents mainly and the world that, yeah, I was very different from what they were expecting me to do. And that, yes, I could find my own way. And then I worked my ass off for the next decade, showing how dedicated and wonderful and intelligent and smart and courageous and all that kind of stuff. I really found that my 20s were a decade where I was really trying to define myself. By the time I got to 29, by the time my Saturn return was coming in, things were already starting to fall apart, because the weight of this self-image that I'd created for myself was not sustainable, and it wasn't actually pleasing. In becoming great at what I was doing, actually what was really going on was that I was becoming a bit of a corporate bitch. I was getting tough, and I was getting hard, and I was doing all the things that I thought I needed to do to make it in the world. Again, it's a really Saturn thing. You have to do this and you have to do that to be able to be promoted. And so I was acting out of character, acting in a way that just wasn't me. And so, in terms of getting the relationship to myself right, that was never right. If it was right, I'd never have done that. I would have found another way that suited the way I like to be in myself. So, the role that I was playing by the time I got to the age of 29 was too heavy on my shoulders. And so that's what I would really say to anyone that's listening in right now, whether you're coming up to 29 or whether you're coming up to your second Saturn return, age 58, or even your third. I'm guessing by that time, you're not really going to give a crap about the roles you're holding on to. I'd like to think that by the time you get to your third Saturn return, you really know who you are. But, there was this acceptance that the role I'd created for myself was not sustainable, but in fact, it was making me ill. And the pressure that I was putting on myself to perform and to be acceptable and to cut it, and all those kinds of euphemistic words that are really saying, chop, chop, busy, busy, must keep working, must keep doing that, stick a broom up your ass and you can, mop the floor as well while you're walking to the water cooler, and all that stuff about maximum efficiency and blah, blah, blah. So, your relationship to yourself is important. And if you haven't seen that so much from your parents or the peers around you, it's something to learn. So it's mastering your own energy levels, what works for your body, what doesn't. Are you using your body properly? Are you not? I'm a fine one to talk. I don't feel very fit at the moment, but I'm not coming up to Saturn return, interestingly. But yeah, your relationship to yourself is really important. Become the person that you're going to like. Realize who you want to be right now. Now, if we go to like the health, which is another one of these things, and it also fits in with your home. A lot of people have their own home by the time the Saturn return comes along, and their health. So it's a bit fourth house, it's a bit sixth house. It's like, how are you managing your life on a day-to-day level? And what's your house like? Is it secure? Is it watertight? Are you able to pay your bills and things like that? All of this is really important as a preparation for a Saturn health check. Because if you're really being yourself and also really able to manage your life and manage your health really well, the Saturn return shouldn't really rock you too much. But if you realize, for instance, like in the example I was giving, that the person you're becoming is not really you, I mean, you might want to ask yourself, am I operating from a place of trauma? Am I operating from a place of dysfunction? Or am I operating from a place of peace and joy and inspiration? And you really want to be working from a place of peace and joy and inspiration, ideally. Because if you're working from trauma or from dysfunction, you're going to make yourself ill. You'll probably lose your house or muck it up in some way. And your health is likely to go downhill. So this is a really strong time to get very, very clear about how you're operating in the world. So very much at the relationship to yourself, and very much then with the people in your life. Knowing how to say, this is what I need right now, and knowing how to receive help is really, really vital. And it's often something we don't think of learning very easily. It's not that important when we're rutting and thrusting in our 20s. It's much more important, I guess, as we're approaching 60. Hopefully by then we might have a bit more humility because we've been knocked around a little bit. So yeah, getting the nuts and bolts of your health and your home is important, because like I said, Saturn tightens everything. It tightens all your structures. It tightens all the rules and regulations and obligations and discipline. So if you think about it, like, what obligations have you got in your home? You've probably got rent, you've probably got bills, power, energy, bank fees, things like that. It's a fantastic time to get overdrawn, but don't do it. You don't want to get your to have Saturn in the form of a bank manager, in the form of someone coming to collect your home, in the form of a police officer because you haven't got things sorted out. Legal things like that can really turn up. So again, in terms of your the health of your home and your actual physical health and how you're managing that, you want to really understand where you are under-resourced. And it's not really a time to make a flashy investment. If Saturn is coming in to land for a short while, he's going to challenge you. Money isn't always abundant at that time, and energy levels aren't tip top. It's usually a time when we, if we push ourselves too much, we realize we haven't got enough savings, or we haven't got enough energy in ourselves saved. Now, again, this sounds really, really boring, but I'm coming to the point of why this is important. This fly seems to like me. Now, before I move on how you can turn it around, the last thing I want to talk about really is your outward career and how you're focused in the world. So for instance, at the times of these Saturn returns, you might be doing really, really well in your career, at your first shot at your career in your late 20s, or you might be working for yourself or going back into a deeper work, or you might be kind of coming to the end of your work or trying to retire a bit early, but there are choices ahead for you. So you want to look at the obligations. What pressure are you carrying in terms of your work? How are you managing the requirements? So, if bosses are putting lots of stuff on you, are you able to say, actually, that's too much, I can't do that right now? Are you doing loads of unpaid overtime and that just seems okay? More importantly, are you actually doing something that you enjoy? Because if you're not, you're taking on more than you care to, and you're also not doing it for something that works for you, which is really going to bring up resentment. And it's really not going to, help you in terms of improving your status. You'll just be the one that gets to the top, but is slightly neurotic, and that's probably not what you're aiming for. So, here's what I would say is leading up to your Chiron, not your Chiron return, your Saturn return. If you understand how to read a chart, that's great. And I am going to be posting the upcoming Saturn returns in Pisces. If you're born in the mid 90s and you're coming up for your Saturn return, if you're born in the mid 60s and you're coming up for your second Saturn return, I'm going to be giving 3 different examples throughout the sign of Pisces. Just before 5 degrees, just before 15 degrees, and just before 25 degrees, to capture the sort of energy of the generation of Saturn in Pisces. So, the first thing I would do is say, if you can read your chart and you understand what the connections between things mean, look at what your Saturn is connected to in your chart. Is it in easy connections with planets? Because where there's easy connections with lots of outer planets and inners, you might find that when your Saturn is impacted, yes, you'll feel tight, but there'll be some great opportunities building. There'll be possibilities and things like that. If you've got a ton of really difficult aspects all pointing at Saturn, then the chances are there's an element of being your own worst enemy, that you're not very good at managing your boundaries, and that you tend to take on more pressure. You tend to take on more than other people are prepared to take on. Difficult Saturn aspects really show where we're hard on ourselves. So yeah, in preparation for your Saturn return, look at the quality of your Saturn in your chart to know if you've got easy Saturn connections or really, really difficult ones. Now, most people have a bit of both. But if you've got a very oppressive Saturn with lots of very hard, difficult energies, in particular, the people who are going through their Saturn return, their second Saturn return, in particular, the ones who are born with Saturn roughly midway through Pisces and towards the end of Pisces, you've got a really, really strong set of oppositions and squares. So, as your Saturn return is coming in, not only is it working with your Saturn, but it's going into squares with your other planets and oppositions with other planets. Now, if you've got easy things connecting to your birth Saturn, as Saturn returns to where it was, it's making those lovely, helpful trines or sextiles, which really get things moving for you. So it's important that you understand the sort of energy that you've got in your chart around that. So that's the first thing. So understand there's those 4 areas of your life that you really want to have a good look at. I mean, they're the foundational ones. I mean, if you were going to be really cosmic about it, you could look at each of the houses in your chart and think, okay, so my personality and my body, my money and my communications, go all the way around, all 12 houses, and see where you're feeling too tight. These are the questions, like, am I feeling tight in this area in my life? Does it feel like things are coming in on me? Am I feeling overwhelmed in this area? Because if you do, you need to do something about it sooner rather than later. If you are feeling tight, you might want to ask yourself, does this belong to me? Does this pressure belong to me? Is this actually mine, or am I taking this on for somebody else? You might also want to ask, where am I under-resourced in terms of this? What resource do I need to be able to feel lighter about this? Or what action could I take right now? If I could take one action, one step forwards to lighten my load here, what would it be? You might also ask, where do I feel resentful? Where do I feel like a victim? You might also choose to ask yourself, where do I feel like a savior? It's important to look at both of those because, again, not Pluto, Saturn really shows us both ends of the responsibility spectrum. So it really shows us the overburdened victim, the person that's saying, come on, give me more, I can handle it. I can do that. I can do that. You know, are you feeling like you're volunteering for everything? Do you feel like everything rests on your shoulders? Because that's a real Saturn thing. And if you are, it's time to let go of it or to be a bit more balanced about how much you're doing. But similarly, if you're starting to feel like a savior, and if you're saying to yourself, okay, where do I feel like a savior right now? You might also realize that you've taken on a lot of responsibility for something, and there's a bit of an ego thing in there as well. And again, that's something to bear in mind as your Saturn returns coming, because where you're feeling overburdened or also where you're feeling a bit smug about what you're doing, Saturn's likely to give you a little bit of a slap back. Ultimately, Saturn is trying to get you into your authentic self. It's really helping you to get that balanced view of yourself, that balanced view in your relationships, that balanced view in your health and your home, and that balanced view in your career. So it's not about being at the top of your game. If you think of the sign of Capricorn, the thing with Capricorn is they like a really long lead time. If you think of Capricorn and that mountain and how long it takes that mountain goat to get from the bottom right up to the top, they don't really care how long it takes because they just know that they're going to get there. They've got that uncanny sense of confidence in themselves. And that's the thing with the Saturn return. You don't need to have owned a house, be married, have kids, or be the vice president or this, that, and the other, whatever your goals are coming up to your Saturn return at 29 or at 58, you don't need to have actually achieved that. And if you're putting pressure on yourself to achieve that by the time of your Saturn return, you could really, really come unstuck. One of the biggest things, and again, this might come up, and I'm just being reminded about it actually, because Jasmina is here saying, hi Louisa, looking forward to our chat on Wednesday. I really am. If you're available on Wednesday, Jasmina, myself, and Kimberly Crow, we're all going to have a conversation about our own experiences during Saturn, because some of them we experience internally and some of them we experience externally, like different things can happen outside of us that can have a massive impact. But essentially, the big question, I think, in terms of the Saturn rings and the boundaries and where we jail ourselves, you might want to ask yourself during this time and leading up to this time, what is mine and what's not mine? So where you're feeling obligations and pressure, does this belong to me? If not, who does it belong to? And if it's not yours, let it go or find a way to step back from it. I think the last thing, so I've spoken about loads of different things. So just to sort of recap, I've been talking about 4 key pillars or 4 key things to master before your Saturn return, and also the attitudes that you might need to be able to master it. So sort of in a nutshell, really think in terms of the 4 angles. So your relationship to yourself and who you're being, and if that's possible, have you created a persona for yourself that is too heavy to carry? Have you created a persona and goals for yourself that you're not going to reach? If you've done any of that, and you're feeling tight, under-resourced, resentful, a failure, a victim, and you're not sure what's yours and what's somebody else's, then that's an alarm bell going off before your Saturn return. Your other one, your relationships, again, who are you taking responsibility for? Or who's responsible for you, and how can you balance it out? It's your time to grow up and take responsibility for yourself fully, and that can be really painful. Then your sort of your home and your bills and your responsibilities for how you're living, and then your external. So the last thing that I really want to say is, there's a couple of images of Saturn. So a lot of people think of Saturn as some kind of nasty old man. You might think of one of your old teachers who was quite stern and, who was, wagging his finger and stuff. Or you might, think of some nasty old babysitter that was a really bossy old cow and whatnot. But actually, I think there are great Saturn examples, and we don't really get them very often. We tend to think in terms of authority as being difficult, and somehow the authority might cramp us. And so our relationship to authority around the Saturn return, we can get quite rebellious and really not want to listen to people. But you actually are the authority that you need during this time. And think of it like a boot camp with your favorite grandparent, like boot camp with grandma. And if you don't have if you haven't got a great grandparent around you that you absolutely adore, or somebody older or wiser, or who's been through a lot and who's survived and been a great example of patience and discipline and making it in the world without necessarily needing to have a fanfare about it, but they've just shown up all the time. It's that kind of energy, that kindness, the empathy, the humility. That's the energy you want to channel right now. And you want to turn that energy to yourself. So if you could channel nice Saturn, and imagine it to be the kind and patient parent that you have always wanted, but maybe never had, it's time to do this for yourself. So in terms of all the different aspects of your life where you might feel like you failed, where you've set a massive goal of something you want to achieve that you haven't quite got there, and you haven't got there, and you're not going to get there, and you can't see beyond that, it's time to kind of take yourself by the hand and sit down and get yourself a slice of cake and a cup of tea like grandma might, and sit down and listen to yourself and listen to what's coming out. And then you really want to sit down and say, it's okay. It's all going to be okay. We all have problems. It all takes time. And sometimes it's really slow and sometimes it's really difficult. And if you can be honest with yourself, and kind to yourself, you will get through it. Now, last thing is, if you can do this to yourself before the Saturn return happens, you might actually get a pearl of wisdom. So, and you might be able to do this for yourself. You might even know somebody who's alive. You don't have to channel someone that's like long gone that you loved and miss, but you might know somebody who's that great Saturn person that's responsible, that's able to do stuff. You might choose a mentor to have in place leading up to your Saturn return. If you can think of great podcasts that inspire you, great books that inspire you, and you've gone through some of the hopelessness that you've wanted to bring into the world that you now realize isn't realistic, and maybe you're being a bit kinder to yourself, now is the time to go and see a mentor and see about the next step you can take. So I really do think that in terms of preparing for your Saturn return, that shift, that if you can look really calmly and honestly at those key areas of your life, and then sort of channel that patient parent, that parent that you wanted, not necessarily the one that was telling you off and judging you and being the kind of nasty side of Saturn, but being the kindness that you know yourself to be. If you can get into that mode and then find yourself either coaching yourself or getting somebody in place to do that for you, then you can really turn around your Saturn return. So, yeah, I feel like a bit of an old giffer now. And if I'd heard this coming up to my Saturn return, I'd have probably said, yeah, whatever. But hey, that's the great thing, isn't it? As you get a bit older, you can see things from a different perspective. But yeah, if you're coming up to that time, I wish you absolute well. I hope it all goes super duper. Like I said, I'm going to be recording over this next week, especially for the people that are going through their first Saturn returns in the sign of Pisces over the next couple of years, and also for you guys born mid-60s who are going through your second Saturn return in Pisces. There's going to be some specific advice for you in alignment with your charts. Now, obviously, if you want something a bit deeper, like really personalized, then feel free to just book a reading. I'm working up until Christmas. I do have a waiting list, but I can probably squeeze you in. And I am taking all of January off, but I'll be available from February. So just go to www.feelgoodastrology.com or give me a shout. It's louisatannermunson at gmail.com, and you can see my address below. But anyway, if I can be of help, if you can get some guidance from my Wednesday live show with Jasmina and Kimberly, whatever we can do to help, we're here. So anyway, lots of love to you wherever you are in the world. Bye for now.